So we had the poll regarding the landlords and the good cause eviction law. And so we asked the poll, do you believe landlords should be able to evict tenants just because their lease is up? Now, according to the good cause eviction law, um, that's not necessarily the case. They can't, just because the term is over, they can't evict tenants. And so that kind of limits the freedom of the landlords and whatnot, but it's also in effort to help protect renters in a time when they need it. So
Hold on a second.
uh,
So did we ask specifically about the provision that allows them, the tenants, to stay in after the lease is up, or just about the law in general?
we asked, the specific question was, do you believe landlords should be able to evict tenants just because their lease is up? And then in the poll write up, I gave background on the good cause eviction law here. And so the results that we got were 53% said yes, tenants should be able to evict, I mean, landlords should be able to evict tenants. 29% said no, 18% said I'm not sure.
Okay. Okay. So
Um,
not, I wouldn't say a strong majority, but at least more people are saying yes than no in this particular poll, right? The no number is pretty low.
Right. The no number here, the straight no number was 29%.
Yeah.
Yes was 53%. Not sure was 18. So, you know, th- you would say people can see both ways a little bit in there, or they just don't, not sure where to put their opinion on here. So, we had there were a bunch of comments on here. There was a lot of discussion on this. Some people were saying that we need, what we need is cheaper housing, not laws that manipulate the market. Uh-oh. Um, so some of the other comments that we've got here, and we brought up in our discussion, was that the problem with the law is that there can be a bad tenant who does not breach the lease, and so they could still be in there unless they do something that would give them good cause to be out. So a landlord could be stuck with a bad tenant or somewhat of a bad tenant behavior-wise. But that becomes an issue as well. And so that brought up a lot of discussion here. Someone gave the example of a tenant who um, kind of like had intolerance for any noise from their neighbors. And so they would constantly complain. And so the landlord wanted them out because they were being disruptive basically to all the other tenants because they were intolerant of any noise. But because of this type of law, they're paying their stuff on time, they're not causing any sort of outward disturbance. They might still be stuck with that tenant.
Yeah.
Although some
Yeah.
could see that as disruptive behavior, and you might have to
I
try to
mean,
argue if that's a good cause.
right. It just seems to create a situation now where once you accept a tenant, you're stuck with them forever, potentially, right? Unless the
Right,
tenant decides to leave or they do something to violate the terms of the agreement, right? They are too
right,
disruptive, noisy, damage the property, don't pay rent. All right, if you have a valid reason, the good cause, right? You have a good cause to evict them. But failing that, if they get
right,
in there and they're paying their rent every month, they're not causing issues, it would seem like you basically what indefinitely now they can stay there
right.
unless
Now, as a
you have a holdover situation like was discussed. Remember, we talked about
right,
that where you have to reclaim the property or something like that. But generally
right.
speaking, it doesn't allow the landlord to ever really get rid of that tenant.
Well, see, now on the flip side, there is another aspect to that. If you are a landlord and you're using that as a rental property, I mean, you want to have 100% occupancy because otherwise you're the one paying the monthly mortgage on it. You're not making
Right.
any money off of it. So
Right.
in that aspect, it does protect your rental property in that regard. Um,
Yeah.
but it's preventing them from doing these massive rent increases.
Right. And I think that's a big part of the financial aspect of it, right? Part of
Right,
this law also talks about the landlord's inability to jack up the rent, right? There's a
right,
reasonable rent increase that you can give, and it's tied to inflation. And so there's a whole
right,
formula, and you can't go beyond that. Now,
right,
if the person were to leave the premises, right? So now you're no longer in a situation where you're raising the rent on your existing tenant, but
Right.
you have a vacant apartment again and you want to re-rent it to a new person. Now,
Right.
if you're saying, I want to adjust the rent I'm going to charge based on the market rate or whatever, you would be able to do that because the
Right.
apartment will be vacant. You're not raising the rent on an existing tenant. You're just starting from
Right.
scratch, essentially, right? And saying, this is what I want to charge for the rent. So
Right.
this law makes it harder for the landlord to do that, obviously, because they
Right.
can't as freely move that tenant out. The other part of it, though, taking the financial considerations away, is what if you just are tired of that tenant? I mean, what if you just don't like them anymore? I'm serious. What if you get into arguments, you don't like them, they're just rude to you, whatever? They're not breaking the lease necessarily. They're not damaging
Right.
the property. They're not failing to pay rent. They're still doing what they need to do legally, but they're kind of an
Right.
ass. You want to get rid of them. Well, now you can't.
Right. Right. Or that's one situation. Or say, for example, you've got a friend or a family member and you want to rent the place to them. The lease is up and you want to give them a place to stay.
Yeah.
It's your property. The question is, do you have that right to do with it as you please?
Right, right. And I
Um,
wonder if there's a situation that's more, I guess, of a gray area. Like, for example, I don't know, the tenant makes a lot of noise. Maybe they're stomping their feet at 3 o'clock in the morning and you can't sleep, something like that. Now, you might be able to say, all right, well, if I can prove it, maybe I can record it somehow and use that as a reason to evict them. They're disrupting my enjoyment of my property, whatever. But what if it's not so cut and dry? What if the tenant is going to say,
right.
no, that's not true. That's just you have thin floors. When I get up in the middle of the night, sometimes it's not my fault that you hear it. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's one of those things where you can't really prove definitively that they're in violation of the contract, but
Right.
and they're going to fight it, but you still now can't get rid of them. So you can't use your discretion anymore in a sense, in a
Right.
case like that, right? Like it
Right.
has to be more cut and dry. Like you got to get them on something concrete that shows a clear violation of the contract.
Right. Right. And then one last comment here. Someone said this is a blindingly terrible idea. Leaving when the lease ends is absolutely basic contract necessity. It's absolutely nuts to even suggest otherwise.
Right. Although it's not necessarily a new concept in that you do have the month to month situation, which has always been the case. If the lease is up,
Mm.
right? And you don't have a new lease with them, but they stay and they continue to pay rent. Legally, you're in a month to month lease, right? It basically
Right.
renews every 30 days. But this just says now, if you're in that situation, the landlord cannot get you out of there
Right.
unless they're damaging the
So,
property or not paying rent, et cetera.
there's I know I said the last one was the last question, but I just saw this one, and this is a good question here. Does this law apply equally to all types of landlords, or do corporate landlords get their magic loopholes? Do
Yeah,
we know about that?
when we looked at it, it did have, I think, a small landlord definition, though I'm not sure that larger landlords are exempt from the entirety of the law. I know it did attempt to differentiate though between small landlords and non-small landlords. So we
Right.
can
Okay.
we can pull this law back up again and see which sections would apply to which.
Okay. Interesting. So, yeah, that's I hadn't thought about that in the previous conversation. Does that also apply to commercial real estate?
It seems actually to be the opposite. Hold on, if this is correct.
Right.
Small landlords are exempt from this. So from what I'm seeing here, the good cause eviction law protects tenants in unregulated apartments from evictions without good cause. The law applies to most apartments, but there are exemptions, including units owned by small landlords, and that's defined as landlords who own 10 units or fewer in New York State. So it isn't necessarily,
Okay.
I was going to say,
Well, you know what, that does change things a little bit.
it isn't necessarily the building, although it also has an exemption for owner occupied buildings with 10 units or fewer, right? So if you have a house and you live in it and you're renting out one of the floors or whatever, then you would be exempt from these regulations as well.
Right. And if you have, a few apartments. So if it applies to people with 10 units or more, this seems like it applies more to some of these big companies that are buying up a bunch of rental properties all over
Oh,
the
oh,
country.
like a big apartment building, maybe.
Right, right. But I wonder if it also applies, I guess it's saying apartment, so it wouldn't apply to commercial real estate. If you
Oh,
own
yeah,
if you
yeah,
own
right.
a
Like
business
a
space.
business. Yeah, I think that's a different situation. This is for
Yeah,
people. Yeah.
yeah. So, okay. All
It
right.
also, by the way, exempts condos and co-ops. So that's interesting.
Right. Um, question in the comments, can't they off this is in the chat. Can't they offer them a new lease? Well, that's the part here is if they're offering them a new lease, they can, but it's to prevent them from severely jacking up the rent between the old lease and the new lease. So there's also a part in that law that says you can't increase it more than a certain percentage in that regard. So it's I think part of it is to give some protection to renters.
Oh yeah, totally.
Uh,
It's also to give protection to renters, but the question is it formulated the right way, and does it burden the landlords too much?
right. So
You know,
all right,
it's
so we had
I was
oh
just
go
going to
ahead.
say, I guess my closing thoughts on is that it still kind of rubs me the wrong way that you're interfering with people's ability to form this contract, right? And to enforce essentially this contract. That if you say, I'm going to stay there a year, and again, when you have a lease for a year, it doesn't mean you're only going to be there for 1 year necessarily, but if that's what you agreed to, right? They're renting you
Right.
this property for a year, you agree to that, you're obligated to that. And then when that year ends, you're like, well, I'm not going to sign a new lease, I'm just going to stay, or what, or you can't, basically, if you want me out, you can't get me out, even though you only agreed to have me here for a year, right? It just seems like burdensome on your ability to enter into a contract.
Yeah. So yeah, well, we'll see how it plays out in practice. We had another poll.
My fault for interrupting again. I was just going to say, I am sympathetic to this idea of not jacking rents up on people too much. And so my thought on
Right.
this was, could you say, and maybe this is bad for landlords too, but could you say that those increases that you're regulating are also applicable to situations where you have a new tenant come in? So, in other words, you're still not able to unreasonably raise the rent, but you can get a tenant out after the lease is up. But just when the new tenant comes in, you can't charge them like 3 times as much rent. Like you still have to have a reasonable increase from what it was before. Could that be a different way
Right.
to